Good morning, or good afternoon, I should say, and welcome to this LatinoJustice Líderes panel discussion on U.S. immigration policies, the impact of the border and beyond. This is a timely conversation that we're really excited to bring to you. If you have any questions and answers, please do drop them either on our Facebook live stream or on our Zoom webinar. Without further ado, I introduce you to Kira Romero-Kraft, who will be moderating this conversation. Give us 1 second. I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. Kira, are you muted?
Yes, I am. Apologies.
Oh, it looks like we may have lost Kira momentarily. Just give us 1 second and we will get started. In any case, yes, this is a Líderes sponsored event, signature event. There are our Young Professionals Board. They hold 4 signature events per year. So we hope that we are able to see you at some more of these events. They do a fall networking reception. They host our annual President's Address, spring networking reception, which they held last night, which was fantastic. And then, of course, this winter panel, which has turned into a spring panel. They've done topics that have included the undocumented, unaccompanied minor crisis at the border, amongst many, many others. And so, yes, we are really, really, really excited for today. And hopefully Kira will join us.
Hello. I am so sorry. Had some technical difficulties. Good afternoon, once again. My name is Kira Romero-Kraft. I'm the director of the Southeast region for LatinoJustice PRELDA, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. And without further ado, Lydia, were you able to introduce everyone, or should I go ahead and do that? Hello? Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Okay, excellent. I would like to introduce Carolina Canizales. She is the Senior Texas Campaign Strategist for the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. Cristina Uturralde Tomas. She is the Managing Attorney for the Atlanta Office of KIND, Kids in Need of Defense. Benita Jain. She is the Supervising Attorney for the Immigrant Defense Project. And Elora Mukherjee. She is the Jerome L. Green Clinical Professor of Law at Columbia University. Welcome to our esteemed panelists, and we will get right to it. There's a lot to talk about, a lot to cover. And so I'll start with the first question, and I'm looking at Benita. Has there been a change regarding enforcement priorities since the Biden administration took office? And if so, how?
So great question to start with. And, you know, just when we're talking today, we just need to remember that the 4 years under Trump were like a bulldozer. I feel like that's something that we can all agree on, right? It seems like there was a new policy or announcement every week about intensifying the administration's efforts to arrest people, detain, deport immigrants using the farthest reaches of the law and way beyond. And as reports and images started to come out, it was like, you know, I remember feeling like and so many of us have been doing this work for years, but a part of the country that hadn't really thought about migration, deportation, and detention all of a sudden did, right? And realized it exists in this, you know, really cruel and unfair parallel universe, except it's right here. And then the last year just flipped the world on its head with the pandemic and all the pain that's still being felt around the world, the uprisings against police violence and demands for racial justice. And now here we are with a new president who promised to make racial justice and equity a cornerstone of his administration. But what we've been seeing so far is not quite that, at least when it comes to immigration. He has reversed a number of Trump's worst policies and executive orders, like the Muslim ban, the Remain in Mexico protocol, technically reversed, and eventually increased future refugee admission numbers after swift pushback. But if we look really closely, what we'll see is that so much has remained the same. And, you know, one example, there's been no progress so far in ending ICE's entanglement with state and local agencies. For example, detainers and the Secure Communities program that are a major linchpin in ICE's strategy to funnel people in the deportation system. Once someone is in local custody, it allows DHS to get information through data sharing and issue a detainer to facilitate ICE picking them up, even though they would have normally been released. And some places refuse to respond to detainers, but since we're talking about the administration's policies and how they've changed or not, I wanted to highlight this as something that has not been shut down by the administration, but it has not, even though it can. And I think the most significant insight into the new administration's enforcement priorities is their interim enforcement priorities memo that was issued in February. And this is essentially, especially when a final one comes out, they're operationalizing their vision for immigration. Whether they will target people, the answer is yes, and how. And what's most concerning to us is that it continues the past administration's misguided use of criminalization in a public safety frame to target people for arrest and deportation. So, if someone, according to the interim priorities, if someone has a conviction that immigration law designates as an aggravated felony, which is an incredibly broad term of art, or if ICE believes the person was gang involved, then ICE agents can deem them public safety threats and target them for every level of enforcement. And that's continued this, the Obama administration's felon, not families rhetoric that reduces people to one part of their lives. And I think the worst of it is that it takes place within what we already know is an inherent racist criminal system. Everything from policing to charging to, who's convicted and sentencing is racially biased and charged. And the very last thing I'll say is that, consistent with this, we continue to see ICE raids. Since 2013, we've been monitoring and analyzing trends in ICE policing and surveillance, predominantly in the New York area, but with an eye towards consistency in national trends to see if they mirror. And, we've put almost 1,600 of them online in an interactive ICE watch map. It's not comprehensive, but it's a snapshot of ICE tactics. And what it's showing us is that even in the Biden administration, ICE continues to have little regard for actual public safety. And their tactics remain similar: super aggressive, multiple armed agents, early morning raids at homes, violent street arrests. And, as an example, in Jackson Heights, a guy was walking to a laundromat. All of a sudden, he was surrounded by plainclothes ICE agents, whisked away with his laundry bag left on the street. This was 10 a.m. in the middle of a densely populated neighborhood. In another, in Florida, ICE agents surrounded a home and ended up dragging a guy out in barefoot and in his boxers. So, what we're seeing right now, I think, based on what the administration is either changing or not with regard to enforcement, is that ICE remains the real threat to public safety and to people living their lives, and a threat to the people around them.
Great. Thank you so much, Benita. You went right for it, and that is exactly the sort of state that we see now in terms of immigration enforcement. And so I think the big elephant in the room, right, is that everyone expected the sea of change when the Biden administration came in. They expected policies to be not only reversed, but things to kind of go back to what was under the Obama administration. And now we find ourselves, to dovetail a little bit to what you're talking about, even the voice system, which for folks who don't know, the voice is the hotline that under the Trump administration was touted as being a way for victims of crime, of undocumented folks, to be able to report and to receive support in that way. The Biden administration has recently reported that they're going to maintain that program, which is, of course, a shock to the community and to advocates in terms of what the reality of that program really is not for that. It really was a way to collect data to use with an agenda that was proposed by Stephen Miller to really try to highlight the criminality of immigrants when the reality is that data shows the exact opposite. And so the big elephant in the room, and I ask any of our other esteemed panelists as well as Benita, why has there not been a sea of changes as folks were pushing for and anticipating? Would anyone else like to answer that question?
Well, I mean, I can start, and it sort of dovetails into what I'll be talking about later. But I think that, unfortunately, we're 5 months into this administration. We have to also recognize and understand that the last 4 years have caused so much damage across the board. And I think we're in a position right now of doing a lot of damage control, trying to fix sort of the low-hanging fruit first, and then tackling the bigger issues. So I think we do have to sort of take a step back and temper expectations. I think that, at least I'm still hopeful, especially at this stage, that we're going in the right direction. Maybe not fast enough for so many of us who work in this space and have advocated, as Benita said, for years on these issues. However, I think that we are sort of seeing slow progress in the right direction. I know that it's not fast enough, and I know that it's definitely the huge impact in human rights violations that are still occurring are there. And we're talking about systems that need changing, training that needs to happen, revamping a lot of these systems, and maybe ditching some of these things that don't work. But I think that in order to do that systemically, there's just going to be some time needed. And I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm being a little bit optimistic, but I'd like to be optimistic in a time when, at least on my end, practicing law here in Atlanta, Georgia, I'm seeing some shifts and changes, especially for my clients and for the community that I serve. So I'm just, very eager to see that we are going at least in a positive direction again. And I'll talk more about that when we get there.
And
Okay.
I can add to that too. And thank you everyone for having me on this panel, and thank you to LatinoJustice for organizing this important conversation. So I want to echo the sentiment that there are still egregious human rights violations, civil rights violations taking place on a regular basis under the Biden administration. But I do think that since January, the administration has incrementally started to move things in the right direction, and I'm very grateful for that. So I'll start with some data and then point to a few specific wins that I think are important to acknowledge and celebrate. So let's look at interior arrests. So in the first 100 days of the Biden administration, ICE has decreased by 2/3 the number of arrests taking place in the interior. That is a dramatic drop. Now, for many of us on this panel, we probably believe it should be much lower, but a 2/3 drop is still worth noting. Similarly, I think it's worth looking at the number of immigration detention beds that are currently full. So during the Trump administration, there were on average more than 50,000 immigrants detained on a daily basis. That number has plummeted. So now, as of about May 14th, when the data has most recently been released by ICE, that number is about 20,400. So that too has dropped by about 30,000 people. I do a lot of work in two areas of detention. One is the family detention space. And for years, I have been working on issues related to long-term family detention of children and their parents in prison-like conditions. And this administration has ended long-term family detention. That is a major win for these kids and families, almost all of whom are seeking asylum and other forms of humanitarian protection in the US. Similarly, just yesterday, the administration announced that it would be closing 2 ICE detention facilities, one in rural Georgia, the Irwin County Detention Center, and another in Bristol County, Massachusetts. Both of these facilities have been under investigation for egregious human rights violations. You may have heard about the facility in Irwin, where women were subjected to non-consensual gynecological procedures. Among the worst human rights abuses that has taken place in modern US history. And under the Trump administration, the ICE was accelerating the deportations of the women who were brave enough to speak out and actually did deport them. Whereas this administration is recognizing that this is a site of gross human rights abuses, that the facility must be shut down. And I hope that this is the beginning of an effort to think systematically about ending widespread abuses in ICE detention and abolishing immigration detention as a whole. That's the direction that we need to move in.
Great. Thank you so much, Alora. And I want to bring in Carolina. I know that from the advocacy perspective, I think advocates on the ground are obviously pushing very hard. And I want to say that I think the wins that we have achieved in terms of the closing of the detention centers, a lot of it has to do with not only the legal defense folks like yourselves that are working on this every day, day in and day out, but also the folks that work on the ground in advocacy and work with the directly impacted communities. Carolina, is there anything you'd like to say about how these changes came about and what the planning is in terms of strategizing, in terms of moving forward with changing some of these other policies?
Yeah, I think the community is tired of waiting. I think we shouldn't go back to Obama era policies because they were as harmful as the ones we are seeing today. And I think our communities, Black folks, Latinx folks, other people of color, Indigenous communities, really ensure that there wasn't a second term, for the previous administration. But we did so because we knew that we deserve better. We deserve better than we've ever seen before. And I think the movement now will continue to grow impatient the more it takes or the slower it gets to do progress. I think we're at a point where every deportation should be a moral crisis again, right? Just because Biden is, or a Democrat is in the White House, doesn't mean that some deportations become less important. They still hurt the same. They still traumatize the same. They still inflict pain in our communities in the same way, even if that person has had contact with the criminal legal, system that continues to be racist, like Benito was saying. So I think for us, it's about really escalating now and really ensuring that they deliver what we've always deserved, which is no more detention, no more deportations, no more criminalization just because of the way we look or the way we behave, so that we can truly live free and actually be able to thrive. I've been undocumented, for 20 plus years. So is my family. And I want to live. I want to live free of fear. And I want all of us in our communities to be able to do that. So I don't think we should accept very little from this administration. I think we should push to get very big things, and what we deserve. And, these victories, and my dog is also talking, so I apologize for that. But, it's like all of these victories are like 10 years of organizing before they even saw what the Irving Center was, before like the incidents happened and they became public. Like the community had been organizing against the detention center for like 10 years because of all of the other violations that they had done previously. And what is sad to me is like, it shouldn't take such an extreme case to realize that I should not be in existence. It's like, I don't know what else we need to do to make it clear that these agencies were not meant to center human dignity, right? To center the needs of the immigrant community. They're just another policing agency with a very inflated budget that operates in secrecy and that continues to terrorize and literally kidnap our communities. So I think I'm glad it's being more visible because of the previous administration. But now it's like, now that you've seen it, you can't accept it, right? That's the next step. We cannot accept it. And I'm excited, to work with other organizers, and I'm excited to continue to push this administration to really deliver. And I mean, truly big, changeful, impactful things. Like, I don't think we cannot just conform, ourselves to little here and there. No, it's time. So we're excited, to continue and to partner, with our legal folks and continue to push as hard as we can, because in our timeline, we only have until November of next year, because we know that as soon as midterm comes, everybody's going to stop talking promises and they're just going to be like, can you re-elect me, please? And then we can talk after re-election. And then no one wants to do any work or do any serious work. So we definitely have a very short timeline to achieve greater things.
Great. Thank you, Carolina. And that I am grateful that you're sharing the urgency that the community is feeling, and how sort of the little wins that, the movement that we see, isn't meeting the need of the community, but at the same time, understanding the structure that is set in place and how it has changed. And I couldn't agree with you more about the Obama administration. I've been, as a former immigration practitioner, it is something that folks don't realize, and don't realize how little changes really impacted the community under the Trump administration, and some major ones as well, but really how this system is a racist system that violates human rights in so many ways. And so I want to turn a little bit to Christina to talk a little bit more about family detention. I think one of the things that people have heard about, and I do see this as a civil rights issue. I apologize. I think someone has some feedback. I'm not sure if everyone can please mute if you're not speaking. But one of the things that I think we all struggle with, that we all see this as a human rights and civil rights issue, but I think the avenue sometimes that we can use is because family detention is something that strikes at the heart of I think, really the immigration system that we've always had in this country. But in reality, what we see the day-to-day, what's happening at the border and the detention systems, is something that folks should understand what a devastating impact this is having on individuals and on families. And Christina, can you talk to us a little bit about how that may have changed and what you're seeing, if anything, in terms of reunifications, as well as the children that are coming to our borders?
Thank you, Kira. Yes, so, I think, again, I just want to remind people where we have been for the last 4 years. And among one of the worst human rights violations that, unfortunately, the Trump administration committed while they were in office is the zero tolerance policies that they instituted. And in 2018, as we all know, families were separated at the border as a premeditated mechanism to deter and prevent families from seeking protection at our borders. I think that, unfortunately, as a country, we're still suffering tremendously as a result of that policy. I have to say, I think it's among the most dehumanizing policies ever instituted by any country. And to me, obviously, my work at KIND, I'm in awe of my colleagues who are working on this issue day in and day out. We are still working with families here in the Atlanta area who, through efforts by our lawyers, by my staff, to reunify them in the middle of this entire crisis, it really caused such a trickle effect, even among our staff. All of us have felt tremendously secondary trauma as a result of the work that we're doing, because we know how painful it has been and how some of the children that we work with are never going to recover 100% from the experience that they went through when they were ripped apart from their mothers or fathers or other family members. I also want to say that while that is the most atrocious human rights violation I can think of, before that policy was put into effect, and going back to some of what my co-panelists have said under Obama, and for a very long time, unfortunately, whenever a child arrives at our borders, if they're traveling with other family members that are not parents or guardians, unfortunately, the policy of separating them has been in effect for many, many years. And so our work with unaccompanied minors and those deemed unaccompanied when they are, taken away from other family members and placed into the unaccompanied minor system is exactly, the heart of the work that we do at KIND. We're constantly working with children from a child-friendly perspective, trying to minimize the damage, unfortunately, that is caused by the very effort to seek protection here in the United States. And so I want to say that, the system that we have in place, as many of my co-panelists have said, it's a system that's been in place for a very long time. And any small changes to get it to the right direction, I agree, Carolina, that's not enough. But, as somebody who's working with, each individual child or family on their individual cases, any progress is tremendous for each and every person that I have to work with. So I have to say again, I do hope and I have a lot of patience maybe for the possibility of us finding more solutions. I want to also say that starting February 2nd of this year, and long before February 2nd, this administration, before it took office, was already seeking the guidance of organizations like Hines and others who are working on these issues, such as Catholic Legal Immigration Network and so many others. Clinic is definitely one of our strongest partners on these issues. The Young Center, Safe Passage Project, seeking the guidance of organizations to understand what can they do, right? And before they took office, having that kind of seat at the table, mind you, is such a huge title change from what we had with the Trump administration. We were not able to even have conversations like that with the Trump administration. So to be in this position now where, February 2nd, the Biden administration launched and instituted a task force for reunifying families. We have, very esteemed people within the system who are sitting and actually, focusing their efforts on how do we bring these families back together. It's going to be a slow-moving process, and it's been a very difficult process for those organizations like ours who have been tracking and trying to find the family members to reunify them with their children. It's been an impossible international, attempt. People going door to door in Guatemala trying to find family members who might be linked to the child that we are working with here in the United States, just to find their relatives, just to find where their parents ended up. And I have to say that, I look at organizations like Justice in Motion, which work in the region. I think I have to, just give my awe and take my hat off to so many organizations that are working on these issues. Family reunification efforts are going to be something that's going to be with us for the long haul. I don't think it's going to be overnight. I think that many people who think that it's going to be so easy to swoop all of these children back with their families or bring their parents here to the United States, unfortunately, we're talking about a very long-term effort. And beyond that effort, beyond reunifying them, there's so much that needs to be done, therapy that needs to be had by these families to, bridge the gap of the separation, about that gap in time that they're never going to get back as families. So I have to say that, there's a lot of work to be done. But what I'm really excited about is that this administration at least is letting us have conversations that are not, fantasy conversations, based in reality, and let's get to work. What do we need to do to move forward from here?
Thank you very much. And I think that is sort of a natural segue to talk a little bit about, we've been talking mostly about policy changes, about things that have been done administratively under executive order. But I think that brings us really to the crux of this issue, is that a lot of these systems undergird what immigrants have been using, which is coming in unlawfully and then having to reunify without a system to support that, when many of them have been here for 10, 15, 20 years and don't have a way. And so we have to find these horrifying conditions for them to travel, and children traveling alone. Recently, there was a story of 5 children in the desert, the youngest being 11 months old, trying to reunify with a family member. So that begs the question, what can we do to address the undocumented issue that we have in the United States? And so I ask all of our panelists, we know we have some bills that are currently being considered by Congress. We know that there have been some movement in terms of different congressional representatives moving on doing different pieces of immigration reform, especially related to DACA. And so I don't know if anyone would like to speak to a little bit about that, where they see that movement. We know that it is a multi-year process, but politically speaking, it's something that is going to take really, the act of Congress isn't even going to work, because we've had opportunities in the past and they haven't. So I'm looking to, what is the state now of the bills that are currently being proposed and that are being considered, and what do you think it will take for us to actually get either piecemeal or comprehensive, I hate to say this, sounds like a dirty word, immigration reform? Benita, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, no, so that's a good question. And right now, there are a number of citizenship bills that have been proposed. A couple that have passed the House that either cover uh, um, dreamers, people with TPS, or essential workers, or farm workers. Biden had led on the U.S. Citizenship Act, which is broader than that. And I guess in terms of, to answer one question about sort of where these bills are at right now, the uh, um, Dream and Promise Act and the Farm Work Modernization Acts have passed the House, and the others have just been introduced. And so there's a question about what will happen in the Senate. Is the Senate going to take up any of these bills? Is there a possibility of getting the bills moved in a bipartisan way or through budget reconciliation? I think the two things I would say, and I think others will have a lot more to say on this, is that, the citizenship bills have come this far because of decades of organizing, and because, there is such a strong need for people to have some kind of relief. The one thing that I would add, though, is that we don't want to double down on again, on the criminalization frame. So I'm also thinking about, who will be impacted and who might be left out. So right now, all of the bills that have been proposed do have carve-outs for people who may have had some kind of run-in with the criminal system. And, I think we need to think about how we talk about who's deserving and not deserving of relief, who's considered a good immigrant, quote unquote, who's considered a bad immigrant, and how do we, how do we do this in a way that's both as inclusive as possible, but also building us for the long-term fight that we need. So let's say one or more of the citizenship bills pass and a number of people are able to get status, right? We also have to remember that the deportation laws that are currently on the books will remain on the books. So just like people can get status, people can lose status. And a lot of that often, especially for people who have green cards, who have status, who might have asylum, happen because of some kind of an interaction with the criminal system. So what we're seeing both current laws and provisions in these bills preventing people from getting status, even though they might have been eligible. And for people who already have status, a conviction can trigger deportation. Often that deportation can be mandatory, often it can be permanent. And then so at the same time, we also need to think about how are we addressing the deportation side that will not go away. That is not going to go away right now, because we need to, in addition, change the 1996 laws that have made criminal system contacts subject such a broad people to deportation, whether they have status or not.
Thank you very much, Benita. And I do want to come back to that point about who are the good immigrants, who are the bad immigrants, and who's being left out. But now I wanted to ask Laura. Laura, can you speak a little bit to the backlog in immigration court and to the issues that Benita raised, which is that, even if you have lawful immigration status, it doesn't mean that you necessarily are not going to be included in the deportation mechanism that is currently in place in the United States. Can you speak a little bit about those issues?
Sure, I'll address all of them. And on the good immigrant point, so let's talk just for a moment to clarify who is considered a good immigrant. So as these immigration reform bills are coming through Congress, the good immigrants include the dreamers, those who have TPS, which stands for temporary protected status, typically those who've been in the United States for a long time. And there's also been a big push for essential workers, and specifically for farm workers. And there's been bipartisan support for farm worker reform bills because on the right, the Republicans and their constituents need cheap immigrant labor to make our food supply system work. And without the enormous sacrifices and the hard work of daily laborers, many of whom are undocumented, our food supply system will collapse. Now, on the immigration court front, I want to say that during the Trump years, the immigration court system largely failed. So in the last year of the Obama administration, there was a backlog of about 800,000 cases in immigration court, so pending open cases in immigration court. By the end of the Trump era, it was about 1.3 million cases in backlog. And so the new administration has an opportunity to reform how the immigration court system works. It has an opportunity to appoint compassionate, empathetic people to the immigration judge bench. I will say that a big disappointment came a few weeks ago when the Attorney General approved 17 new immigration judges, all of whom had been vetted under the prior administration, almost all of whom had risen through the ranks as prosecutors and as ICE personnel, instead of taking a new look at potential appointees to the immigration court system. The immigration court's judges are overworked and underfunded, and as we're talking about legislative efforts, we should also think about whether it is appropriate to have the immigration courts report to the Attorney General. So with immigration judges not having life tenure or being real judges, or whether they should be an independent court, one where judges are afforded the life tenure or some other guarantee that they can adjudicate cases without undue political interference. What we saw during the Trump era is that many progressive immigration judges left the bench, retired, quit, because they could no longer withstand the intense pressures that the administration was putting on them. So as we think about reforming the system, we need to think about how the immigration courts function.
Great. Thank you so much, Elora. Those are very important points, because I think most people don't realize the role that the immigration court plays, and in terms of them not being an independent body. And so I want to get back to the question regarding and thanks for touching on it, because I think it's very important to really think about the way the narrative of immigrants and immigration is portrayed in this country. And I'm looking at Carolina, because Carolina, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about this. We know, or we at least what we see, and I think you can tell a lot the rhetoric that you hear about DACA, about Dreamers, about temporary protected status, and I would argue that even temporary protected status is not portrayed in some circles as something that is a benefit, right? Especially not to the folks who currently hold that status. But if you could talk a little bit more about this good versus bad immigrant, or how immigrants in general are portrayed, and why it matters, why this narrative is vitally important to speak on and to talk about.
Thank you. And I hope that others also add. But, language impacts policy. So the language that we use should be messaging the vision that we want, right? And the more that and what I mean by that, it needs to be human-centered. It needs to be about the ability to be who we want to be. Like I say, we want to be free, we want to thrive, we want to be respected, we want to have dignity, right? But for so long, I was in the immigrant youth movement when I was young, right? And for so long, we had to there's these conditions in this country where you kind of have to prove yourself. Like, oh, I have a 4.0 GPA. I am a hardworking, student. And all of that is just like, I feel like our desperation, right? Our desperation to be accepted, to be welcomed, to be able to be here and be able to go to college, right? Like the Dreamer fight started because undocumented folks couldn't go to universities, right? Like they couldn't go to college and pay what people paid. We had to pay international fees, right? So it was a lot of desperation that built this Dreamer undocumented youth movement. And through the years, thankfully, it has evolved, right? And I think the undocumented youth movement, the TPS movement, and all the others who have sort of gained status, in the ladder of assimilation, it is our responsibility to continue to evolve the way we speak about all immigrants. And it's our responsibility to keep pushing to broaden sort of the picture that the general public has, around immigrants. We're all human. We're all not going to be Harvard, graduates, and we're all gonna make mistakes. And we can no longer dehumanize people for the mistakes that they've made the way we have. Because if we continue to separate us, if we continue to say, oh, pick me first because this other person is violent, right? Like, don't pick them. We're going to continue to influence policy to be drafted and written in that way, where only an exclusive group gets things and the rest don't matter. And I think the danger of some, like Benita was saying, all of these bills unfortunately have that good versus bad, right? The danger to me, and what I would be so sad about, is if one of these bill passes and then that's it for the next 50 years in this country. No, we gotta be broader. We gotta, like I say, our language needs to evolve, and it needs to be human-centered. It needs to be as inclusive as we can make it, not only for the 11 or 18 million, that we have here already, but for the millions that are going to come. We need to consider climate crisis. We need to consider, unfortunately, more war conflicts that are going to bring this new wave of immigration that we haven't seen before. So as we continue, to advocate, our language really, really needs to evolve, and it's urgent that it does, so that whatever does happen, if it happens, it leaves us that opportunity to continue to broaden it instead of no window at all. And like, that's all you get for the next 50 years. See ya, whenever you elect another president that cares for this, like, we cannot do that, because in those 50 years, we're going to have waves and waves of new immigrants that are going to be climate refugees, et cetera. And then that we're not thinking about because we're so selfish, right? That we only think about the ones that are already here. So I challenge us to evolve our language so that we can continue to evolve the types of policies that are being written. And for those who still use, like, I'm a hard worker, I am not a criminal, I just came here, to have a better life, I challenge you to reflect on the words that you said and sort of ask yourself, who am I impacting when I separate myself from these type of things, right? Who am I impacting? Because we cannot advance this harmful silos sort of language. It is just so harmful. And again, because I was an immigrant youth organizer, I take it so that it is also on me, because I was part of a narrative that was harmful when I was a young, undocumented immigrant trying to just go to college. So I have evolved, and I'm so grateful for all the partners that helped me understand how our narrative was harmful. And I'm so glad that I can now, say that I'm an abolitionist, and I believe that everybody deserves to be here regardless of their path in life. And I hope that we all take that as a responsibility, that we all challenge ourselves every day in how we frame things and how we talk about things, and most importantly, on how we advocate, for legislation or for new policies to come. But please add, I'm very passionate about this topic. Thanks for asking me about it. But I hope that others add, how they're feeling, things that they're doing, etc.
Thank you. And I absolutely, if anyone else wants to add to that point, but I want to just pivot very quickly. We have 4 minutes left before we open up for questions. And I know I still have about 20 more questions, but I'll have to stop 10 minutes before the hour. And I will put in a pitch to the woman power here is pretty awesome. And I want to just be in appreciation of that as well. But Benita, I want to quickly talk about, let's talk a little bit about that criminal alien or criminal immigrant narrative. That's really not a narrative. It's part of the law. Let's talk a little bit about how low the threshold is, even as it relates to DACA. And so folks can get an understanding about how it's not only that immigrants are being portrayed as immediately, being a criminal once they come in. That isn't enough, right? To put us in a terrible light, but also about the fact that this is written into law and what that impact has. What impact that has on someone's ability to apply for immigration relief.
Yeah. Yeah. So, really to talk about that, we need to talk about a set of laws that were passed in 1996, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. Those are the cornerstones of today's deportation policy that relies on the criminal system. And that's also what's fueling the jail to deportation pipeline for so many of us. And, the impact of that starts from an arrest when local police in some places will turn people over to ICE, to jail where detainers result in ICE contact, to after a person is released, sometimes after the charges were dismissed and sometimes because of a conviction. And then, to really focus on your question about people, I think you're asking about people who don't yet have status, right? Um, as an example, someone who's undocumented but is eligible for DACA or maybe eligible for status because they're married to a US citizen spouse, whatever the whole range is, even under current law or policy, may not be able to get that status because of, it could be because of a drug possession conviction. It could be because of a fight or a shoplifting charge. It could be because the government believed they engaged in drug trafficking or prostitution, even if there was not a conviction. So it's incredibly broad. Sometimes it's based on having misdemeanors, like depending on what kind of relief you're talking about, which again can be incredibly broad. But I think the core piece here is, and it partly also goes to the narrative when we're talking about who belongs and what kind of stories we're telling about our people and all of our people, is, I think about it as how these laws are reducing people to just one thing, right? When they came to the US, if they've ever been arrested, if they've ever struggled with addiction or alcoholism, whether they've been over-policed their whole lives and landed in prison. And it's also not recognizing the connection between other systems, right? So like on one hand, we're acknowledging that the criminal system is wrong and there's momentum for marijuana justice and decarceration. And at the same time, we're continuing to say that all of these things that are happening to people in the criminal system, it's acceptable to then take those that we're on one hand saying are wrong and then say, but it's not wrong to still use those and instill this double punishment on people and use it to detain and deport people, or deny DACA, or TPS or a green card, or to deport someone who's had a green card for 30 years as a result of that same system.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add to this? Does anyone have any?
I do. I think I just wanted to just reemphasize something about the concept of reframing. If we could envision a day when, migration is viewed as a human right, a basic human right that we have. I want to also talk about what Carolina mentioned earlier, that, we have this, phenomenon that's happening across the globe, which involves not only COVID, but also, a huge climate crisis that's causing people to move, and I think that what we need to understand is that at the core of everything, and I speak, both as a mother and a daughter, we all just want to protect our families, right? And we want to have the ability to go to the place where their future and their well-being is going to be better off. To be able to recognize that and use that as a building block to a new system, not the current system, because our current system would never look at that possibility. I think that's the direction that we need to go in. I am, again, hopeful, and I'm going to say, back to something Laura said, an incremental, small change, the shift in not using the word alien. What a huge moment in our history that's just happened under this administration. And I do think that that's something that, again, it's so tiny, but in the larger picture of reframing this entire possibility of a new vision, I think it's groundbreaking.
Great, thank you. And so I would like us to then use this opportunity to talk a little bit about how do we actually change a narrative? Have you seen it in your communities? Have you seen it in action? And Alora, do you have any sort of, I think that clinical professors are sort of, I think all of the folks that provide pro bono services folks that work in the public interest are the superheroes of our profession. It makes me very proud, but I also think clinical professors are right up there. They do the amazing work of not only providing the legal services directly, but then also training new and young lawyers to come into the field. So, and I love that, the energy that is shared. Typically, I've had amazing experiences with clinical programs. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your thoughts are regarding changing the narrative, which I think is something that is vitally important to the movement?
Right. So I would love to echo what all of my amazing co-panelists have said. We must change the narrative. It needs to be a broad narrative that includes as many people as possible, hopefully everyone. And at the same time, we need to be making change, making real change, taking advantage of this limited opportunity we have, as Carolina pointed out so powerfully, to actually get things done. And it is an enormous pleasure to teach law students and to work with the next generations of lawyers and those who will hopefully go on to be movement lawyers and direct services lawyers, working hand in hand with the affected communities and uplifting and empowering the communities who are most affected by this to be at the forefront of the fight for change.
Great, thank you. And so, do you have something to add, Carolina?
Yeah, I was just gonna, like, all the points here are so, like, yes, migration is a human right. Everyone should move like butterflies. You know, the monarch butterflies gave us that lesson, right? And but I do think too that one key thing that I've seen evolve in our movement as we share our stories is that we no longer measure like how good or how bad, right? We just talk about the human, right? Like we just talk about the whole human. Like Benita said, it's not just one thing that happened in someone's life. It's all the things that happen, you know, in someone's life, because we are holistic people. And I think as we share our stories, or hopefully as the media, you know, but the media is also another thing, another media apparatus, you know, how they decide to frame our stories. But I think it's good to continue to practice that, right? Like it's not just one aspect of someone's lives, it's all of their lives. And how can we continue to tell a story that encapsulates that so that it is normalized, right? So it's a normal thing that a human being, you know, had something in their past or made a mistake. You know, it's a normal thing to talk about versus, oh, this thing, no, like punish, right? They don't deserve anything. No, like that's such a very basic view of people, right? Like very like limited view of people. We need to evolve that into, oh, I understand why this person did what they did, right? Like look at all their circumstances and all of their lives, you know? I think that's the huge shift that I've seen. At least when we talk about undocumented youth now, it's not just, we don't even wear our caps and gowns anymore because we don't need to. We were more than students. We were always more than students, you know? And I think that's the kind of shifting that we need. And as we talk about all the beautiful and diverse immigrant community that we have in this country and that will continue to arrive, right? So.
Great. And so I end with this very quickly. We only have 5 minutes left, but I'm sure that most of you have received either questions from neighbors, sometimes even in the doctor's offices. I can share that I've received good and bad. And so, but I will say that overwhelmingly, I've received folks that want to do good. I mean, my fellow residents, citizens of this country, they are all interested in helping and doing something to impact change. And so I leave you with this question. What would you tell your neighbor who says, how can I get involved? What good can I do? You know, they have citizenship status. They're not under any threat of deportation. What would you tell the average person who doesn't have an immigration issue on how they can help the system? And I invite anyone to jump in with their response.
I would love to start. And at least here in Georgia, I would say, you know, support our community organizations that are working so hard on these issues. You know, sometimes I get jealous of advocates like Carolina, like I wish I could be in a position to speak openly and freely about all of these issues, much more than I can sometimes. But, you know, there are organizations like Freedom University here locally. I really just want to put a plug for them, you know, that need the support to continue their programming to assist young people who, at least in the state of Georgia, are still fighting towards being able to go and attend public universities, at a state rate. Unfortunately, they don't have that right still, and they're working towards it, again, school by school. I admire their efforts, and not only that, but they need help. They need, people to volunteer. They need people to support. They need people to fund their books that they use during their freedom schools. So I would say start, as locally as you can. There are so many organizations. El Refugio is another organization that's worked so hard for years and years on the issue of detention here in Georgia. And I'm so honored and pleased to see the efforts that they've made haven't gone to waste. Such a huge victory yesterday with the closing of Irwin Detention Center. And, they have been inextricably linked to the efforts towards doing just that. So, support everyone you can who it's so funny. Sometimes I walk down the street and my neighbors, when they learn what I do, I think they're just blown away, and they want to support whatever it is that, I have to say in terms of like where to go and put their energy towards. Even as simple as hosting a dinner and fundraising towards any cause. I've encouraged people to do that. And that's so simple. You don't have to even open your doors to anybody else or go anywhere. Just invite your friends over and, just raise as much or as little as you can towards any of the causes that you feel passionate about.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. Anyone else would like to add? We have 2 minutes. I think those were all excellent points. Anyone else? Well, with that concludes our programming. I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your busy days to share your expertise with us, and mostly your passion, as well as helping us to find the guidepost on how to move forward with this very difficult topic that touches every single aspect of American life. So thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us. I do want to share that we have a panel coming up, Overcoming Obstacles, Law School and the Legal Profession and Immigration Status, scheduled for Thursday, June 10th, as well as our Latina Trailblazer event, which is normally a must-see event. You cannot miss it. Please join us again on June 15th. And my name is Kira Romero-Craft. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us at LatinoJustice, PRODEF, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. And with that, thank you all so much. Enjoy your day.